Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one we're going to go over my round 8 game from the Charlotte Spring GM-IM Invitational. Now, if you followed the round 7 video and just the tournament in general, you know that it's actually been going pretty well, and I'm actually on +2 after my 7th round draw. So to get a GM norm in one of these closed norm events, you actually need to get +4, which is 6.5 out of 9, and I was currently on +2 after 7 rounds, which is 4.5 out of 7. So in order to try and get a GM norm, I needed to win this game. So it was kind of a must-win for those aspirations, and I knew it, and my opponent knew it, and everyone around knew it. So I really was trying to, really go for it, but also be kind of measured in my approach because, everyone else knows too. Now, my opponent in this one was, International Master-elect Gauri Shankar. I say elect because he has like 5 or 6 IM norms, but hasn't crossed the 2400 barrier yet. So he's still a very, very good player, and I'm sure he's going to become an IM fairly soon. And actually, the last time we played, he beat me up pretty bad and always gives me a pretty tough game. So definitely was pretty alert, but it was a good opportunity to try and get to +3, which was the aim. So, yes, that was what I was trying to do. So, anyways, I was black, and let's get into it. So, Gauri went knight f3. I went d5, c4, e6, and g3. And I actually kind of expected this, to be honest, because Gauri had been toying around with a lot of English setups connected with the kingside fianchetto. So I was noticing he was doing that against Grunfelds, against King's Indians. And pretty much if you're going to fianchetto the bishop and play c4, it's pretty much a very positional setup. And there's no way to really, kill it right off the bat. There's no way to, really just, destroy that setup. It's very, very solid. So my approach going into this game was not to try and go crazy, but to try and just develop and get my pieces out and get a game and hopefully outplay him over the course of the game. So that was pretty much my aim, was just to treat it like any other game and trust that my positional understanding and my higher rating would eventually come into play. So anyways, I went c6. Not really the most popular move here. Normally it'd be normal just develop the knight to f6, but I wanted to tease the idea of capturing on c4, because when you play c6, you kind of are threatening a capture, because white can't play like queen a4 check and recover the pawn because it's blocked. So Gauri went bishop g2, and I actually kind of thought about taking on c4 here, but it was actually a bluff. I never actually wanted to take on c4, so my c6 escapade was maybe a failure because it, cuts out some move orders, but it is what it is. So I went knight f6, but if I was to take, this would have been a very different and complicated game after a move like d takes c4, castles, and b5. A very, very sharp game could ensue. Typically, a4 is an idea here to undermine the chain. There's b3 as an idea as a pawn sacrifice, to open up this bishop and get it to b2 very quickly. And you can see I'm woefully behind in development. So it would be a very, very sharp game, and I hadn't analyzed it, so I didn't want to go down that path. So I went knight f6, and now Gauri went d4. I went knight bd7, castles, and bishop e7. And we've kind of transposed to a certain extent to these Queen's Gambit declined Catalan variation positions. And the reason it's the Catalan is because this bishop on g2 has the potential to exert a lot of influence on this diagonal. And so when you have a Queen's Gambit declined with the fianchetto bishop, it's a Catalan. So queen c2 is played. That's a good move. You defend the c2 pawn, and some lines you think about playing rook d1. If you've watched any videos on this channel before, you may have seen that I lost a pretty important game earlier in this tournament to Grandmaster David Burgess in round 2 in this very, very specific setup with queen c2. So I was definitely hoping not to repeat that mistake. In that game, I put the knight on e4 and went for f5, and that was a little bit too much. But so I knew I had to do something a little bit different because it looked like he was doing the same thing, this queen c2 idea. I castled, and he went knight bd2. And knight bd2 is an interesting move. I think there are pros and cons to it. One of the pros is that you are defending the c4 pawn so that you can potentially recapture on c4 with the knight if I release the tension in the center. And you also support an e4 push. The con with knight d2 is that it's not on the most active square in the center. That would be the c3 square. So it's not directly, challenging a pawn in the center. So in general, knights are better on the third rank than they are on the second rank just because they're more active. So that's one con. Another con is that this knight on d2 actually blocks the bishop on c1 from developing. And in these Catalan structures, the bishop normally wants to be on the f4 square where it has a really nice and unopposed diagonal. So there are pros and cons to this move. Again, I've played knight bd2 a lot myself in the past. But and there are pros and cons to every move. So I went b6 now, trying to, develop the rest of my queen side, get my bishop to b7 or potentially a6. But this does invite the move e4, which was played. And this is a kind of a critical position because there's, first of all, a really, a dynamic pawn tension here. And there's also this credible threat of playing e5 and kicking my knight from my natural developing square on the f6 square. So I really have to be kind of, keen here on deciding what I want to do because there are many different paths from here, and it's kind of like, do I take the pawn? Do I let him push? Do I keep the tension? How do I do that? I went for bishop b7, inviting e5, and part of the reason I did that was motivated by the nature of my tournament situation. Again, I did want to ultimately win this game, so I was kind of willing to take a little bit more risk than usual to try and do that. And after e5, I felt there would be an imbalanced position, whereas if I went for some of the other choices, I thought it might be a little bit too drawish. One of the things I was concerned about was if I played d takes e4 and helped this knight come to e4, and then I go bishop b7, I was wary of lines where after there's knight takes f6, and knight e5, and I just didn't like the fact that this knight and bishop were, hitting me hard on c6, and I'm pretty pinned here, and I could go for queen c8 and prepare the c5 break, but then that would result in even more trades, and I wasn't even sure if I would be okay there. I might actually be worse. So I just wasn't super sure of the consequences. One thing that I was thinking about if I go queen c8 is a move like rook d1. And the point is that if I go c5, trying to liberate and trade these pawns on d4, I think d5 might actually be strong. The point is that after e takes d5, c takes d5, white still has the space advantage and keeps some pieces on, and is also threatening knight c6, which would result in, black almost certainly having to give up the bishop pair at some point because the knight on c6 cannot be tolerated for an extended period of time. So I was just kind of like, I don't know if I can play this type of position. It's a little bit passive. And then on the flip side, if I take on e4 and then I take on e4 again after knight takes e4, you see the queen comes to this very active post, and again I have problems on this diagonal, in particular defending the c6 pawn, because if I put the bishop on b7, the c6 pawn is pinned, and again the knight might pile on, knight e5 might be a move, and you can see all these pieces piling on the c6 pawn. It's very unpleasant, and it kind of reminds me of like a two results game where white is kind of playing for a win or a draw. One of the other captures I could consider was d takes c4, but the thing I didn't like about this is that, again, now the knight on d2 makes sense, and after knight takes c4, you have a scenario where both these knights are eyeing the e5 square, which is unpleasant, and the d6 square can be very sensitive. So one way that white could take advantage of that is maybe playing bishop f4 and then putting a knight on d6. And I just thought this is a little bit much, just because I think white has more space, and a safe advantage. So I kind of toggled through the d takes c4 approaches, and I didn't like either of them. So I thought I'd just continue developing and allow e5, even though I recognized that was incredibly risky. So I went bishop b7, and white went for e5, naturally. And now I have to make a decision with my knight. And I decide to go knight e8, which is Not a very, attractive move to make. This knight is very passive here. Also, my knight is moving away from the king side where it was defending the h7 pawn and just some important squares. So I don't love the knight on e8, but I thought it was going to be temporary and that I would hopefully be able to relocate it to c7 and get some counterplay with c5 undermining white's chain. So my idea was that if white is a little bit slow to the punch here and I'm able to get something going in the center on the queen side and undermine white's space advantage, I thought, okay, things will turn around. White's next move I thought was pretty strong, though, and kind of, signaled to me that maybe I hadn't worked things out as clearly as I wanted to. Because White's next move was c takes d5. And I think c takes d5 is a very, very strong move and one that I just really underestimated. The reason it's so strong is because neither choice is so attractive. If I go e takes d5, I went c takes d5, but if I go e takes d5, now white has a kingside pawn majority. This 4 versus 3 against my pawns is going to give white really good attacking chances. And there's scenarios where f4, f5 might just run me over really quickly. So that was something to be wary of. And then on the flip side, if I go c takes d5, which I did do, I do get the c file for my rook, which is nice, but my knight on e8 no longer has the d5 square. And what I was banking on was if white played a move, let's say like rook e1, let's say, I was banking on going knight c7, and then this knight ultimately being the piece that goes to d5 after I play c5 and open up the position. But by playing c takes d5 right away, Gauri's actually taking that square from my knight, and it means that the knight is not going to find a great home. So I think it was really, really good move and just very, very alert on his part, because it seemed to me kind of counterintuitive to trade here and give me the c file. But it turns out it's not as big a factor as I thought. So anyways, white went rook e1 now. It makes some sense to get the rook out of harm's way of a potential bishop a6, which I was probably going to do at some point, and to challenge that rook on this diagonal. The other thing that it does is it actually prepares a King's Indian attack style initiative or maneuver with this idea of maybe playing knight f1 and knight e3 and knight g4, or sometimes they go h4 and then knight f1, knight h2, knight g4, just trying to get some initiative on the king side in the closed position. This is the typical maneuver where you shift this knight over towards the king side in that fashion. Because now the knight is on d2 and e4 has been played, it has no more purpose there, and it needs to go to another square to enable the bishop on c1 to move. So rook e1 makes a lot of sense. I went rook c8, challenging that queen. I mean, that's really my only source of counterplay right now is the c file. And white went queen d1, which is another good move. Just ceding the c file, but, pretty much saying do your worst, because, you control the c file, black controls c file, but what are you going to do about it? And, I wasn't really sure what to do about it. I went bishop a6. And the idea with that was that if I had an extra move, I was going to rush to d3 and try to shift this bishop towards the king side, because I would love for this bishop to be on the g6 square. It would be almost like a Caro-Kann bishop outside the pawn chain, and it would be securing my king a little bit more. So let's say if white plays a move like a3, I would go to bishop d3 extremely happily and quickly, and then if my bishop is challenged, it just goes back here. And in some lines, I might even consider a move like bishop c2 hitting the queen. So I was really hoping to get to d3. Alas, it was not meant to be. White went knight f1, and you could see that now my bishop cannot go to d3 because the queen is guarding that square, and white is clearing the square, the diagonal for the bishop on c1 to get out, maybe go to f4, and again entertain this King's Indian attack style maneuver with the knight coming to the king side. So you could see here in the closed position, it's almost kind of a race. And the race is white is going to try and, pound me on the king side with h4, h5, get at my king, weaken some squares, kind of roll me over. And what I have to do is try to stir up trouble on the queen side, in particular on the c file, because that's really where all my play is coming from. So let's see who's first. I went knight c7, trying to, again, fix this bad knight, that was, blocking the connection of my rooks. I talk about connecting the rooks a lot. The issue with knight c7, though, is I'm blocking my own counterplay on the c file, and that's a big problem. And the second issue is that I'm not so sure where this knight should go next. And, you tell me. I mean, on b5, it blocks my bishop on a6. I mean, okay, a8 is kind of a pitiful square. And so you can argue that maybe the knight on c7 is not so great. Now, one thing I did consider instead of knight c7 was queen c7. And the point is that with queen c7, in some lines I'm eyeing the c2 square, trying to trade queens. Because again, if I can trade queens, then this king side initiative is not going to be a checkmating initiative, right? It might be some pressure, some space, but I'm not going to be checkmate if the queens are off the board. But the issue is that after queen c7, there's this knight e3 move, and again, I can't infiltrate on the c2 square. So that's kind of the persistent problem is, even though I do have control of the c file, you can see that these squares are all controlled by white. And so all the squares on white side of the board on the c file are tough to get at. So anyways, knight c7, white went h4, continuing with his own plan of, playing on the king side. And I was kind of like, man, this is going to be very quick initiative by white. I need to figure out how to get some play going. One thing I thought about was actually playing f6. The point is that if I play f6, I liberate, maybe my rook on f8, and I get some counterplay before he runs me over. But I thought the weakness on e6 that would be created was a little bit too much. So, for instance, if e takes f6, maybe bishop takes f6, and this e6 pawn is extremely sensitive and backward, and now this knight on f3 could maybe even go to g5. This knight here could maybe go to g5 and get some pressure on this e6 pawn, and also eye the h7 pawn, and even a move like queen h5 I have to be concerned about now. So I did not think f6 was worth it because it would just weaken more squares around my camp. And one thing you have to think about sometimes when you are facing a pawn storm of any kind is that you need to be wary of pushing the pawns around your king, because even though you think you might be getting a little bit active or stopping your opponent's pawn storm, a lot of times you actually wind up accelerating their play because you're kind of opening up the front that they're trying to get at anyway. So I was hoping that I could play on the queen side and kind of, distract white sufficiently where he's not going to crash through. I went rook e8, thinking that in many circumstances it might be good to have another minor piece kind of eyeing the king side squares. And I thought, okay, if I go to knight on f8, I'm guarding h7, which could be important, especially now that knight g5 and queen h5 was something I was thinking about. So then white went bishop g5, challenging my bishop, and I think this is another great move. One thing I was thinking about was bishop f4. I thought that was the natural move, just putting it on f4, making sure that I never play f6, and just keeping the dark-squared bishop in the attack. But it actually turns out that on g5, what he's doing is actually removing a defender around my king. And one could argue that this bishop on e7 is actually the most important minor piece that's defending my king. So it actually does make sense to kind of get rid of it. I went h6, challenging that bishop because I thought I couldn't allow the bishop to stay there. But maybe not the best move because, again, now that I push this pawn to h6, I've created what you can call a hook, which is that now that if a white pawn ever advances, it could kind of latch onto the h6 pawn as a target to pry open the position. So h6 was maybe not the best move, and I kind of should have maybe considered playing a move like knight f8, just ignoring this bishop and, prompting him to trade. Because at the end of the day, he can't actually push h5 if the bishop is still on g5 because I have, the queen on d8 and the bishop on e7 hitting that bishop on g5. So h6 kind of didn't help my cause. After h6, white went bishop f4 now. And I think that was really clever because he's pretty much acknowledging that since I created this hook, now I want to retain this bishop on f4 to sort of pound away at that hook on h6. And so I was already seeing a move like queen d2, putting more pressure on h6, knight h2, knight g4, putting a third piece on h6, and then, sacrifices become, really possible. So really alert move, bishop f4. I went bishop b4 now because I thought now this bishop moved away, I'm at least free to move my bishop and get some counterplay on these diagonals. You can see my bishops here are the only things that are kind of active in my position. And white went rook e3, getting out of the way of the bishop on b4. I was surprised by this move, and I think I can honestly say I was surprised by at least 10 of Gauri's moves in this game, because I thought that rook e3 disrupted the coordination of his pieces. I thought the bishop rook was very awkward here because now the queen couldn't line up against the pawn on h6. But it actually turns out the rook is kind of mobile here because once white pushes away this bishop with a move like a3, this rook can swing to c3 and lead the way against the c file. And it turns out the rook is actually not so bad there, and I can't get at it very easily. So, very nice move. I went knight f8, trying to get my knight over to g6. Now that the rook was in the way on e3, I thought this was the perfect opportunity to try and get the bishop pair. And if I was able to secure the bishop on f4, I would not fear any attacks whatsoever, because a move like g takes f4 would not only ruin white's pawn structure, but it would give me some targets on the king side to play with. So I was not at all concerned if I managed to get the bishop pair. But he wasn't going to allow this, and Gauri first went h5, which was really effective, just taking away that square from my knight. I thought originally that the plan was to go a3, and then if I go bishop e7 back, now rook c3, and you can see that this bishop can now move to e3 if I'm hitting it. But actually, if you play rook c3, you actually help me facilitate some trades, and maybe a move like knight b5 is not one that he wanted to see. So that did not happen. h5 happened, and now I went knight h7 because my knight is kind of grasping for squares here, and on f8 it couldn't go to g6. I didn't want to go back to d7. My pieces are so congested, and I really thought maybe one day my knight can go to g5 if one of these pieces leaves. I don't want to recapture after piece captured on g5 with my h pawn. I want to be able to recapture with the queen. So it was very imperative for me that I wouldn't rush with knight g5 until one of these pieces left that square. And then, if my knight actually does get to stay on g5, maybe e4 one day could be a really, really nice outpost for that knight. Knights in particular really, really love outposts. Now, again, the issue in my position is really the lack of space. And, I've managed to get these bishops, on some reasonable diagonals here, but the issue is that when you lack space, you want to trade a few pairs of minor pieces to relieve the congestion, because then you avoid the problem that I have in this position, which is that my pieces are kind of stumbling over each other. But, Gauri has not been cooperative at all. He's been really stubborn, saying, I'm not going to help you trade pieces very easily. I'm going to make things hard for you. And that has not helped my cause. So, really good play on his part. Now, he went queen a4, hitting my bishop on b4, and also eyeing my bishop on a6. And I think this is a good move, just putting my bishop away. And I went bishop f8 now, retreating all the way back to the back rank. Not a move I wanted to play, but I thought, okay, now it's at least tucked away. Maybe in some positions down the road, a rook isn't coming to hit me with check. So I thought, okay, the bishop is going to stay on f8 for now. And, it does seem that in the past few moves, I've at least sufficiently distracted him from the initial fear that I had, which was like rolling me over with g4, g5. I do have minor pieces on the king side now that kind of have shored up that initial wave, so not bad. The one thing, though, it maybe instead of f8, I could have gone to e7, because now I facilitate that knight g5 move that I was talking about before. So maybe bishop e7 was a little bit better. Anyways, after bishop f8, white went rook c1, and I think this is a great move, and again, kind of shows that, white is kind of in control. The queen is putting pressure on this bishop. This rook is putting pressure on this knight. And now there's just this immediate threat of rook takes c7 and then queen takes a6, getting two pieces for the rook. So really, really big problem for me here, and not very easy to deal with, because the natural move would be to move the bishop away, but then a7 hangs in many positions. So very, very tough spot. And I did think, here I'm probably, close to losing, because, again, if you look at my position, it just looks like, after rook ec3, it looks like all of white's pieces are infiltrating on the c file. And I have so many passive pieces on the back rank, it's hard to imagine, me being able to salvage this. So I was very, very upset with the position I had, but I had to fight. And I found an important resource here, which was b5. B5 was a move actually my opponent missed and gave me a lot of credit after the game for finding. It was kind of out of desperation. It isn't even a great move, but the point is that it at least kicks the queen. And the idea is that after, queen d1 was played, but the idea was that if queen a5, my plan was actually to make the very ugly move knight e8 work, knight a8 work. Point being that I challenged the queen on d8, and the rook on c1, so that even though you can win this bishop on a6, the rook on c1 is hanging and I pick up an exchange. And then so the natural move would be to actually just trade queens, but now I've managed to, cover up my weaknesses, and I managed to hold my position together. So this was the idea, actually, was with b5, was to go knight a8 after queen a5, and he saw that and, gave me high marks after the game, and instead decided to go back with queen d1. So I managed to, at least not lose material right away, but b5 is a big-time weakness from the standpoint that I've weakened two very critical squares in my camp, the c5 square and the a5 square. And these squares make it very, very problematic to defend my queen side, and even give white potential outposts for his minor piece in the future. Already you have to consider moves like knight d2, knight b3 to control one of these outposts. The secondary issue with this is that I've totally shut down my bishop on a6, which was one of the few pieces in my minor piece in my camp that was actually doing something. So kind of a problem. I went knight a8 now, trying to trade some minor pieces and challenge on the c file before white got rook c3 in. Perhaps a better move was b4, but the reason I was wary of playing b4 is I thought the queen could come right back to a4 and do the whole dance again, challenging my queen side and my minor pieces, so I was not so keen on it. But maybe this was an option. There are some scenarios where maybe I can give up the a7 pawn by playing a move like bishop c4, and arguing that if you play a move like b3, you really soften up some of your queenside squares, particularly c3 and a3, and maybe I could sack a pawn in a position like this, playing like, I don't know, bishop b5 or something, and arguing that after queen takes a7, you've won a pawn, but you've lost some coordination. Maybe. Just an argument. I'm not saying it's the case, but at least I might have some counterplay with a move like bishop d7 and then knight b5 or maybe rook a8, and get something going on the weak a2 pawn that's backward and the a3 and c3 squares. So I didn't go for it. I was a little bit concerned about that, and I went knight a8. And after knight a8, white took on c8, queen takes c8, and then went rook c3. And I think this is, again, reasonable chess, just, trying to still control the file and keep the status quo in white's favor. I went queen d8, trying to, still eye some of my weak squares, particularly the a5 square. And my dream scenario was maybe getting a knight to c4, and sort of blocking the c file. Because, again, you can see these squares are a little bit too sensitive for me. But white now went knight d2, and you can actually see that white's really, really quick to getting a knight to b3 and getting a knight to c5 or a5. And I thought if a knight gets to c5, if a knight gets to c5, I thought I'm in really, really big trouble, because giving up the bishop pair would not be a good thing to do there. And then the knight would actually get the d4 square after c takes d4. So I just did not feel good. I went b4 as a sort of drastic measure to distract white from getting this knight to c5. and rook c1 was played. Good move backing up. And now I went queen a5, trying to get at the a2 pawn because I'm trying to get counterplay at all costs before this knight got to c5. White went knight b3 anyway, which I think was very alert and is actually something I kind of missed. The point is that if I go queen takes a2, there's actually rook a1, and I'm actually losing a piece on a6 because queen takes b2, rook takes a6. I don't believe white has enough compensation for the piece here, and well, you can see all my remaining minor pieces are extremely passive, so it's hard to imagine I can play like this. So, really good move because it just stops me from taking on a2. And because of that, I wind up going queen a4. And you can see now that the knight does have the opportunity to come to c5, and this is not what I wanted. So knight c5 was played. Now you can see my bishop is hit, my queen is hit. I pretty much am obliged to trade queens. I went queen takes d1, and after rook takes d1, the dust is settled, but you could see even though the queens are off the board and checkmate isn't evident on the G file, you can see that white's just totally dominant here. Again, the difference in minor pieces is astounding, and the lack of space is astounding. And these things give white a very, very large advantage. So not exactly the best winning attempt for me in this game thus far. I went bishop e2, trying to not give up the bishop pair. Again, if I play bishop takes c5, I thought this was a slow death because after d takes c5, not only is the c pawn a protected passed pawn, now this knight can come to d4 at some point. And the knight on d4 is just going to be a monster piece because it blockades my own passed pawn, and it just, controls everything from the middle. So I thought I couldn't allow this. So I decided to leave the monster knight on c5 and play bishop e2. At least this hits the rook on d1, hits the knight on f3, and just gives me a tempo to get my bishop out the way. White went rook c1. I think that's a good move, just getting to the open file. You also could have argued for rook e1, kicking my bishop away, and then going rook c1. But rook c1 right away is fine. And now I went rook c8. And this was my kind of big idea, was to pin this knight on the c file and at least be able to contest because it's pinned. Now, I thought, okay, I could fight here, and I was actually, in a decent spot, but it still turns out I have a terrible, terrible position. And, well, it's just not very good. My queen side is extremely weak. This knight on c5 is a monster, and all that white needs to do, really, is to get some of these pieces towards the queen side. Get this bishop maybe to f1 at some point, maybe this maneuvering this knight over here, maybe to b3 at some point, and would be in good shape. Now, to my surprise, and I think, honestly, to everyone's surprise, Gauri actually went and played knight e1 here, and it was a huge shock to my system because I was like, okay, the knight on e1 this is an interesting maneuver. The knight is coming to d3, b4 is going to be hanging. This is a huge problem. The knight maneuvering over here and getting to another active square is a huge problem. But isn't the h5 pawn hanging? And I stared at the position for a while, and I was like, what is he doing? Why is he giving up h5? What am I missing? What am I missing? I mean, I know I have these weak pawns, but what am I missing? And I stared at it for a few minutes, and I was like, I think he just blundered a pawn. And I took. And then it was quite clear from his surprise that he actually did see that he blundered a pawn and was like kind of upset with himself, but he was in time trouble, so he didn't have time to think about it too much. And but I could see that, oh my gosh, I won a pawn. I won a pawn. And I was really excited because finally I thought I was in the game. The ironic thing is, believe it or not ironic, but the interesting thing is, even in this position, white is much better. And I think that's really, I was shocked when I realized that after the game, but really it's because the placement of this knight on h7 and this knight on a8, and even my bishop on f8, I have so many passive pieces that even in this position where he gives up a pawn for nothing, he's actually still better. So, pretty funny, he just continued with knight d3, And you can see here that this pawn on b4 is super weak, and it's really tough to defend it. Note that if I make a move like a5, now this pawn on a5 will be weak. And I was already thinking about a move like knight b7, which forces a trade of rooks. And after a move like bishop takes c1, you can see here the pawns are still very, very weak and loose and can be attacked. So it's amazing that even here I'm worse. Note, if I continue to push them, he can continue to attack them. So that's pretty much the gist of it. So anyways, I'm still worse here, and I thought, you know what? I recognize that, but maybe while he's trying to go for this b4 pawn, I can stir things up. And so I decide to not play the best move, which was a5, to defend the pawns, because I thought that he would trade the rooks with knight b7 and it would kind of fizzle out. And I took a major risk here and went for the move. After a5, I played a5 first, and knight b7, I decided to play rook c4. And rook c4 is pretty much the product of me kind of saying, you know what, I don't want to trade all the pieces. I don't want to draw the game. I want to keep things on the board. I want to keep things going. But it's really, really a faulty move and based on pretty much nothing, it seems. The big idea is that if you play rook takes c4, I go d takes c4, and I have this really nice pawn chain on the queen side, and I retain my extra pawn. Fine, that's good. But the issue is that he doesn't have to take this rook on c4, and that's a problem, because if he manages to lord over the c file and take that over, I'm going to have a big problem with my weak knight on a8 and my passive pieces. So after rook c4, he spent a few minutes thinking, and then played the quick and alert knight takes a5. And then it was here I realized, oh my gosh, there's kind of no going back. I have to take this d4 pawn, and I have to kind of live with the consequences, but I'm not so sure what the consequences are, because this rook comes down to the 8th rank, and all my pieces are bad. The only one that's active is the rook on d4. So I played rook takes d4 thinking, okay, there's no way back. But it turns out the position is completely lost after the move bishop f1, which he played. And it was here that I kind of realized what I had done, because the more I looked at the position, the more I realized the only piece that's doing anything is the rook on d4, and that is not enough to make a position, playable. All my other pieces are so passive that even though I'm temporarily up a pawn, that's not going to suffice. So I thought here for a while, and I was like, uh-oh, this is really bad. This, endgames look bad. And the issue that I kind of realized is I would love to play my knight to b6 to get it off the back rank. But knight b6 kind of loses on the spot to bishop e3, just skewering my rook and my knight. And you also need to note that knight c7 just hangs my knight because the rook is now controlling the c file. So all of a sudden, my knight on a8 looks trapped. My rook on d4 has one square. My bishop on f8 is tied to the back rank. And my knight on h7 is just doing absolutely nothing. And I was like, oh my gosh, what have I got myself into? So my only sort of saving grace in this position was that I was up a lot on time. And I was thinking, okay, he is in some time trouble. Maybe if I make some challenging and quick decisions, he might mess up and I might get some chance. And I started with the move rook e4. My idea with rook e4 was to just get out of the way of a potential bishop e3 and to threaten the move bishop e2, trying to facilitate a trade that would give my rook a little bit more breathing room. So I thought rook e4, okay, my rook is now on e4, it's kind of protected, and I also have the option now of going knight b6 without getting skewered like before. So now white went bishop e3, good move. Again, dominating my knight. You can see the bishop now is controlling b6. The rook is controlling c7, and my knight is totally dominated. Big problem. I went knight g5 now, trying to get some counterplay while I recognized my knight on a8 was done. So I thought, I need to try and get some sort of, counterplay on f3, something going before I lose my knight, and this was kind of my desperate attempt. White went rook c8, challenging my knight on a8. And now I took my chance and went knight f3 check. That was the idea. And after king g2, to go d4. And the point is now with d4, this bishop is cut off from b6. And I was thinking that if I manage to trade this bishop for this knight, I'm in good shape. White went rook takes a8. And I went d takes e3. And after f takes e3, I thought I'd done some good here because now the dust is settled and the material is equal, but I have the bishop pair, which I like, and I have a better pawn structure, which I like, but I'm still lacking some coordination, and my bishop is extremely passive, and this knight can really come over and wreck my style very quickly. The problem was now I was in time trouble, and some of my calculation was not as clear as before. One move that I really wanted to do was to play the move rook e3, but I did not do that. I went knight takes e5. The reason I was a little bit wary about rook e3 is after rook e3, I wasn't sure what I should do after a move like knight c6. But it turns out that there are quite a few resources here. I mean, on the one hand, I might be able to play rook takes d3 and knight e1. I might be able to give up a piece by just going knight g5 and playing for compensation. For instance, if knight g5, knight e7, king h7, rook takes f8, maybe I can get some counterplay here while this rook and this knight are on the back rank. I'm not so sure. It looks bad. I give you that. But the point is that I need to play with some activity to get something going counterplay wise, and rook takes e3 was a way to do that. Instead, I played knight takes e5, and this is a critical blunder that I completely missed, because after knight takes e5, rook takes e5, I walk into the move I was afraid of in the first place, which was knight c6. And the issue is now that the knight hits the rook with tempo, and knight e7 check is threatened, so I'm losing a piece. Huge oversight and time trouble, and just a terrible move, terrible decision. I went rook c5 now, trying to salvage some counterplay. Note, I could take on e3, but then after knight e7 and king h7, I have no more checks because the bishop is guarding the second rank, and I thought it was important to get to the second rank and now try and gobble up some of those queenside pawns, because now that I'm losing a piece, that was where my salvation was going to lie, or so I thought. So I went rook c5 to just keep that rook as active as possible. And then knight e7 check was played, king h7. Excuse me, I just sneezed. Ooh, another one. Okay, hopefully that's enough sneezing. So after knight e7 check, king h7, I had ideas of going rook c2 if rook takes f8 was played, but white very alertly played bishop d3 check first. And this is a very important move because now I don't have rook c2 check myself. And so I have to block with f5. But after rook takes f8, you can see my rook can't go to the fifth rank to attack the bishop, and it can't go to the second rank to give check. So I'm just completely losing. I only have a pawn for a piece. So really tough scenario, and I should be losing this game. However, my opponent was still in time trouble, and I was still trying to kind of mix it up because I thought, if I'm able to get my rook to the second rank, I will have counterplay on these pawns. So I thought I need to try and do that at all costs, try to get the rook to the second rank. And I decided to try to do that with rook c7. I think this is a very alert move, and I was happy to play this. The idea is that now I'm hitting this knight, and it doesn't have many great squares to go to. Note that g6 is covered, d5 is covered, c6 is covered, and you can't play rook e8 or rook f7 to defend that rook because the bishop is controlling that diagonal. So very careful here for white. This knight does not have many squares. And the knight wound up going to c8 to save itself. But now the rook on f8 and the knight on c8 lack a little bit of coordination just at this moment, and it allowed me to play rook d7, which turns out to be a saving move. The point is that now this bishop is challenged and doesn't have any particular amazing square to go to. And after bishop c4, which was played, I have finally access to the second rank with rook d2 check. And I think much to the surprise of my opponent, after king g1, I did not play rook takes b2 because, I win one pawn, but the bishop guards the other pawn on a2, and that would free up white to, move his own pieces. Instead, I went rook d1 check. And amazingly, the king has no way to get out of this perpetual. The point is that these pawns on g3 and e3 are just, getting in the way of white escaping on the third rank. And after king f2, rook d2, you can't continue to go forward because my rook and bishop do a great job of cutting you off. So you can't continue to go forward, you can't block on e2, and it's just a draw. And after king g1, rook d1, king f2, there's nothing to be done. I just continue to check. Now, the really funny thing is if you go king g2 trying to avoid this, and then rook d2, and then king h3 trying to actually make it to the third rank, you actually get mated after bishop g4 check, king h4, and rook h2 mate, or even the funny g5 mate. And both of them, the king is just totally caught on the side of the board. So it turns out that after rook d2, this perpetual is the game. It's a draw. And so Gauri was kind of shaking his head, realizing that he'd let one slip. And I was shaking my head for separate reasons because I was like, wow, I played such a horrible game and managed to hold. But also the draw took away, took away my opportunity of getting a GM norm because I really need to win both games to finish the tournament with 6.5 out of 9. And so this tournament was not the GM norm event I thought it might be. So in any case, I was lucky to draw, and I think given my circumstance, I should be kind of happy, but I wasn't. I thought it was just not at all the type of game I wanted to play, but it is what it is. So anyways, I had 5 out of 8, and I had one more round to go, and I still had to keep my head up. I was still on +2, which is not a bad score, but not exactly where I wanted to be. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by making a contribution in the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks. Take care.